Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into something pretty interesting: how different folks, specifically developers and researchers, tackle AI problems. It's a contrast you might even recognize from, your own work.
Absolutely. It's this fundamental split, isn't it? You've got the let's roll up our sleeves and build it crowd,
Yeah, the doers.
and then you've got the ones who uh, instinctively pump the brakes and say, hang on, what are we really dealing with here? What are the limits?
Exactly. And we're basing this on a really neat article, Yonyan Loa. It
Mhm.
uses this great water bucket analogy and a case study about building an Apple recognition AI. Really brings the whole thing to life.
It does. The article nails that core difference right at the start. The developer, often optimistic, right?
Yeah.
Thinking, let's just get this thing working.
A bias towards action, you could say?
Totally. Then the researcher often leads with more caution. Let's figure out what's not possible first. It's about mapping the constraints.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. Unpack these two mindsets, look at their assumptions, their strengths.
And maybe more importantly, their potential pitfalls. By the end, hopefully you'll have a clearer picture of how these approaches play out in AI, and maybe, just maybe, see some reflections in your own world.
Okay, let's start with the developer mindset. Let's just do it. What's the driving force there?
Well, it often comes from a real confidence in their technical skills, a belief that with enough effort and ingenuity, they can engineer their way through almost any problem.
We've got the tools, we've got the talent.
Exactly. Let's just jump in and tackle the problems as they come up. It gives projects momentum, which is definitely valuable.
And the article points out they lean heavily on past successes, right?
Oh, massively. It's that we built something kind of similar last time, so this should work too. Thinking. They adapt what they know.
Which sounds sensible, but
But it can be a trap. The availability heuristic, over-relying on what's easy to recall. Past success doesn't always map perfectly onto a new, maybe subtly different challenge.
and that leads to maybe not checking feasibility quite as rigorously up front.
That's often the crux of it, yeah. Because they're so focused on building, they might not ask those really fundamental questions first.
Like, is this even possible with what we have?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Or, do we actually have enough data for this? They might just start coding, assuming they can figure it out as they go.
Mm.
That's where unexpected roadblocks can really derail things.
The Apple AI example in the article is perfect here. What was the developer's initial thinking?
So the task was recognizing apples. They had, what, 100 images?
Just 100, yeah.
So the developer thought, okay, 100 images, let's feed them into a model, we'll see what accuracy we get, and then we'll just tweak it, tune the parameters, train it more until we hit the target. Very iterative.
Probably picked a standard image recognition model.
Likely, yeah. Something off the shelf, maybe a common CNN architecture. But those models really need good, diverse data.
And that brings us back to that water bucket analogy.
That's such a good one. The developers focused on pouring the water in, building the solution, without really checking if the bucket, actually holds water.
They assume it does because they've filled buckets before.
Right, they're putting in all this effort, but if there's a fundamental leak, like not enough data, a lot of that effort might just, well, drain away.
Okay, developer. Action-oriented, maybe sometimes too action-oriented. Let's flip to the researcher. Let's confirm what's impossible first. What defines their approach?
Caution, fundamentally. A belief that understanding the problem's inherent limits isn't a roadblock. It's actually the first step to finding the right solution.
So identifying constraints is part of the design process for them.
Exactly. It's not about pessimism, it's about realism. They lean on theoretical analysis, scientific principles.
And they run experiments.
Definitely. Small-scale tests early on. They want to validate their assumptions.
Yeah.
What are the real boundaries here? What can we actually achieve with this data, these algorithms, the computing power we have? It's about gathering evidence.
Which means they're more willing to say, okay, this specific goal just isn't going to work.
Absolutely. They're less attached to one specific outcome from the get-go. If the analysis or the early tests show a target is unrealistic, they're ready to change course.
They'd rather find the best possible achievable solution than chase an impossible one.
That's the core idea. Design the optimal solution within the bounds of feasibility.
So back to the Apple AI. Target: 97.5% accuracy, 100 images. What was the researcher's first reaction?
Immediate skepticism, like, whoa, hang on. Their knowledge of deep learning would scream that 97.5% accuracy on image classification usually needs way more data.
Thousands. Tens of thousands.
At least, often hundreds of thousands for really robust models that don't just memorize the training data. So Seeing 100 images next to 97.5% accuracy would set off alarm bells based on established knowledge.
And the bucket analogy works here too, but differently.
Totally. The researcher is the person who picks up the bucket first and inspects it thoroughly.
Looking for holes, checking the material, measuring its size.
Right. Before even thinking about filling it, they want to know its capacity, its limitations. Is this even the right container for the amount of water we ultimately need? If the goal is a gallon and they've got a teacup, they'll say, we need a different container.
Okay, two very different starting points. The article summarizes this contrast nicely. Let's walk through some key differences. Starting mindset.
Developer. Empirical optimism. My experience says this is doable, or we can get close. Researcher. Scientific skepticism. The principles suggest this might be impossible, as stated.
How they handle risk or potential problems.
The developer tends to be reactive. Fix problems as they pop up during building. Researcher. Proactive. Try to anticipate and design around potential problems by understanding limitations up front.
And the kind of solution they aim for initially.
Developer often goes for a minimum viable product, an MVP. Let's get something working, then improve it.
Get it out the door.
Yeah. The researcher aims for a validated, optimal design from the start. Based on that initial analysis, make sure the foundation is sound.
And causes of failure, according to the article.
For the developer, it's often sticking with an approach, even when fundamental limits, like lack of data, make it unworkable. Thinking more effort will fix it.
Trying to patch that leaky bucket indefinitely.
You got it. For the researcher, failure often looks like identifying what won't work early on. Which isn't really failure, is it? It's avoiding wasted effort and redirecting towards something that can work.
That really sets us up to look closer at the Apple AI case study mission. 97.5% accuracy, 100 images. We know the developer was optimistic based on past cat projects. How did that play out?
Right. So based on that 50-image cat thing, they thought 100 for apples. Plenty. They jumped right in, grabbed an existing model, started training on those 100 images.
And the first results weren't terrible, were they?
No, they got something like 80% accuracy initially, which probably felt like, see, we're on the right track.
Just need to push it that last bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they doubled down, spent more time tuning, tweaking, trying to squeeze more performance out of those same 100 images.
But then, the real world happened.
Yeah. When they actually tried to use it practically, accuracy just tanked, dropped to like 50%.
Ouch.
And it was making really basic mistakes, right? Calling green apples pears, yellow ones lemons. It just hadn't learned what an apple really is in all its variety.
Back to that leaky bucket. Big time.
Absolutely. All that effort trying to patch the accuracy holes, but the bucket itself, the 100-image data set, was just fundamentally too small, too leaky for the task. Couldn't hold the water no matter how much they patched.
And the core reason for that failure?
The article pins it on that over-reliance on past experience, underestimating how much good data AI needs, especially for high accuracy. The model hadn't learned to generalize. It had kind of just memorized those 100 pictures.
Okay, now let's replay that scenario with the researchers' confirm impossibility first approach. Their reaction to 97.5% with 100 images.
Deep skepticism right away, questioning if it was even feasible. Their theory told them it was probably not.
So not just a gut feeling, but based on AI principles.
Exactly. They knew deep learning needs data, lots of it, to learn properly. So they didn't just jump into training the final model.
They did experiments first.
Right. Small tests, train on 10 images, see what happens, train on 50, train on the full 100.
What did they find?
Accuracy went up a bit, sure, 50%, 70%, 80% maybe, but it was inconsistent and nowhere near that 97.5% target.
Yeah.
And it confirmed their suspicion.
Which led them to what conclusion?
A clear one. 100 images. Not going to cut it. Not for that level of accuracy. Based on theory and their mini experiments, they estimated they'd need, well, a lot more, maybe 100,000 images, minimum.
And crucially, they reported this back.
Yes. They didn't just keep quiet. They went back to the company and said, look, the goal is admirable, but with 100 images, it's not feasible. To get near that target, we need something like 100,000 images. They showed their work.
And when they actually got that data?
Then they could get serious. They were given the 100,000 images, and the researcher designed and trained a model properly. The result? 98% accuracy. It worked, and it worked reliably, identifying all sorts of apples.
So the bucket analogy holds, assess the container first.
Absolutely. Researcher checks the 100-image teacup, says this won't hold a gallon, then designs the right gallon jug, the model trained on 100K images, to actually hold the required volume of accuracy.
It's a really stark difference in outcome. But the article suggests it's not always either. There's potential for collaboration, right?
Definitely. The most powerful results can come when you blend these approaches. You need the researcher's grounding in what's possible, what the limits are.
The reality check.
Yeah, but you also benefit from the developer's knack for practical solutions, for finding clever ways to implement things or even work around some limitations.
And the Apple example showed this too.
It did. So imagine the researcher says, okay, 100 images isn't enough for 97.5%. The developer, thinking practically, might then suggest, what about data augmentation?
Creating more data from the existing images. Rotating, flipping, changing brightness.
Exactly. It's a technique to artificially boost the dataset size and variety. The developer brings that practical tool to the table.
And the researcher's role then?
Is to analyze that suggestion. Okay, augmentation helps, but how much? It's not the same as 100,000 real images. They can then maybe revise the achievable goal. Perhaps with augmentation on 100 images, a realistic target becomes, say, 90%, not 97.5%.
I see. So it's a negotiation informed by both perspectives.
Precisely. The researcher defines the fundamental constraints, the developer proposes ways to navigate or mitigate them, and together they land on a realistic, achievable path forward.
It's like the researcher says the bucket's too small, and the developer says, okay, but maybe we can use these three smaller buckets together.
That's a great way to put it. A creative, practical solution, but one that acknowledges the initial limitation identified by the researcher.
The article wraps this up nicely, bringing back that bucket analogy one last time.
Yeah, it's quite vivid. The developer's initial bucket, full of holes, leaking water everywhere, leads to failure, maybe some red faces when the AI calls an apple a pear.
Because they just jumped in without checking?
Right. The researcher's bucket, though, built carefully after checking the requirements. Sturdy, reliable, holds the water perfectly, leads to success, recognition.
So the big takeaway really seems to be, in complex fields like AI, just weaning it based on it worked before is pretty risky.
Extremely risky. That crucial first step is often figuring out why something might not work with your current plan or resources.
Yeah.
Understanding the impossibility first actually lights the path to finding what is possible.
And that final thought in the article is quite pointed.
It really is. The developer trusting blind experience with bad data ends up, well, looking a bit silly. The researcher who did the hard work up front, assessed the limits, demanded the right resources, they become the valued AI architect.
The lesson being that rigor, that upfront analysis of constraints, is often what builds the foundation for real success in AI.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That researcher's mindset is becoming indispensable.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, the core idea is that stark difference. The developer's rush to build versus the researcher's drive to first understand limits. It really highlights how vital that upfront understanding is, especially in complex areas like AI.
And it makes you think, doesn't it? How does this play out in your own work, your own projects? Maybe you've seen that build first, ask questions later approach lead to less than ideal outcomes.
Or maybe you've seen the benefits when someone did take the time to really assess feasibility before diving in deep.
Yeah, identifying those potential icebergs before the ship hits them.
Which leaves us with a final question to chew on. As things get more and more complex, not just in AI, but everywhere, how do we get better at blending these two modes? How do teams, how do individuals harness both that developer's drive and that researcher's critical eye?
Is there a perfect balance?
Yeah.
And how do we actually cultivate it? How do we encourage asking, is this possible? Just as much as how can we build it?
Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.